Welcome back to the Ignite podcast. I'm your host, Brian Bell. Today, we're delighted to have John McGlothlin on the podcast. He's a former paratrooper and captain of the Army, Inspector General, adjunct professor, author, lawyer, even former video game journalist, I just learned. John, I'd love to get an intro from you for the audience.
Certainly. Well, you covered a lot of the bases, but I've got a lot of energy. And I was one of those folks that bounced around between different things, enjoying each of them. And then I realized basically during the pandemic that the best way to sort of collect those assorted experiences into something that was useful was to write a book about them, centered on my military experience, but drawing from those other things as well. So still have a day job. I'm temporarily full-time Army again on there's just sort of orders where you can switch back from part-time to full-time,
right,
while also doing book-related training and appearances as well.
That's amazing. So you'll love this. My father-in-law, who lives with us, is a retired sergeant major, and used to teach at Fort Devens. He ran the interrogation school there.
No way.
Yeah,
I was a former human guy. I went through an interrogation school in Arizona at Fort Huachuca, which is where a lot of intel stuff is centered at now.
You probably know a lot of the same people. His name is Lloyd Sparks. So if you ever run across that.
That sounds familiar, actually. And it's a pretty small world, and it's a small community within the small world. So I did that. And then basically I was 9 years full-time Army, and then was like, I want a more stable life. I've had my fun. Let me go part-time, and then I can live where I want. So now I live in Washington, D.C. I got married. That's everything. I was like, I'm going to die alone if I stay full-time Army. The dating prospects are a little dire.
Yeah. It's like, hey, I ship out in 3 months. Do you want to start dating? Yeah.
Yeah. If you prefer the personality types I prefer, it's more about big city folks. So that's what I ended up doing. Worked out great, happily married. But I spent my fair amount of time in the middle of nowhere doing that sort of stuff before I decided to switch gears.
That's amazing. Yeah, you guys probably know a lot of the same people. So, for people wondering out there, how'd you end up in the Army? What was that story like?
So I had planned to go into journalism when I graduated. I went to Florida State for undergrad, had an amazing time, maybe a little too good of a time at times, but was still on track to get a decent job as a journalist. And then 9/11 happened. And sort of took a look back. My dad had been in the Army before I was born, so I didn't grow up with it or anything. But I thought, what else is out there? And then I learned that you could join the Army and learn Arabic as part of your job. So I thought that's an amazing opportunity. And that's what I did. I went ahead and joined the Army, did the Arabic program, went to Iraq once, Afghanistan once. And then, as I said earlier, it was like, okay, I've kind of gone on the roller coaster a couple of times now. Maybe it's time to see what the rest of the amusement park of life has to offer. So decided to call it there. But that's why I first joined, was 9/11 basically, and realizing the military offered opportunities. What I realized later on a more meta level was I needed to round out who I was as a person. And it's kind of funny that I boomeranged back to development with the book, because it wasn't something I thought about for a long time. It was an instinctual more than an analytical decision to join the Army. I just sort of looked at soldiers and I thought, they have something I don't, and something I should work on.
Yeah.
So it was like, well, there's an office you can go and join them. It's not hard to do. They're not hard to find. So I did that. I definitely rounded out as a person. Very glad for the experience.
Yeah. Yeah. I've never met anybody that regrets the experience, I think. And it's something I almost did 20 plus years ago when I was getting pretty serious with my then girlfriend, now wife. Almost joined the Navy as a pilot, and I took the ASTB, all that stuff. And I was ready to go, and then I got accepted into the Air Force Academy as well. And I didn't go. So there's been twice now in my life where I came very close to joining the military. And I often wonder, how that would have changed me as a person now. It's counterfactual. Who knows? But,
yeah, exactly. You want to speculate, but you had already at least met your wife. So you had a fairly well laid path in front of you outside the military. For me, it was
a big part of it.
Yeah. For me, it was like, well, I was way too, I won't say dorky, because dorks got more dates than me. But I was not nearly anywhere close to meeting my wife at that point. So the military did not have nearly as much competition for my future as it did yours.
Right. And then at what point did you get your JD?
When the U.S. government passed a bill saying we will help pay for your graduate school.
Nice.
So I was the inflection point of having done there's always more to do in the military. There's always more to learn, but I had done enough to at least look at doing other things. And then they passed the GI Bill right around that time. I thought, I will go to med
Early
school.
2000s,
Yep.
kind of mid 2000s. Yeah.
Yeah, more towards, well, I should say they passed a new version of it. It existed before, but then they passed the new version of it like mid to late 2000s. And I thought, I'll go to med school. And then I looked
Yeah.
up how long med school takes. I thought, I'll go to law school. And luckily, standardized tested me get along better than me and grade point averages do. So took
Yeah.
the LSAT. I was like, and I also have to get into a good enough school to make it worth the opportunity cost. So did that, got into UVA, was very thankful for that, had a wonderful experience there, and then have done a variety of legal things since I got out. Some with the military as a JAG officer, some on the civilian side at a nonprofit law firm, and then some in the middle as a Pentagon contractor.
Yeah. And then, so tell me about the origin of your book, How to Deal with Damn Near Anything, The Paratrooper's Guide to Life.
So the origin of it, before anything else, was an extremely clunky transition from military life to civilian life, but not clunky in the way that you hear a lot of stories where the veteran is suffering and they can't necessarily adjust. It was the opposite. I was having a great time, but I was annoying a lot of people. I was way too sarcastic, way too judgmental, way too intense. And I gradually realized that that was not a successful strategy. And the tricky thing is it was successful enough. It
Yeah.
was one of those things where if it had been a disaster, I would have been driven to change immediately. But it worked often enough to not need immediate change. But over time, I learned that I was holding people to a set of standards that they never asked to be held to, asking them to live a life that they didn't sign up for, literally didn't sign up for. So what I realized is I was judging people for not having been taught things that they never had the chance to learn. So that didn't make any sense. So I thought, okay, what is it exactly that I think they don't have? Because these are people that were smart, they were nice, and good socially, good morally, no issues. But they were often struggling in ways that were inexplicable to me. And what I settled on was, hey, in the military, I had the privilege of having certain traits developed, and I picked 5 for the book, that are either rarely or not developed elsewhere, certainly not in the same way. So I thought these are useful lessons that I can bring to people and hopefully they can benefit from, and they can see that and plus I looked at a lot of other writing about the military, and I love anybody who takes the time to write their story, especially if they're in the military, is worth giving credit to. But a lot of the military stories are either about combat, which been to Iraq and Afghanistan, understand why those stories would be first to get told, but they're not relevant to day-to-day life for me. So, or they're about intensity. They basically tell people, pretend you're in the military to learn from the military. Get up at the crack of dawn, do 10,000 push-ups, run to the desert until you see God, and all these other crazily intense experiences. But you don't have to do that either. I was like, I don't and I understand that it worked for these folks.
Yeah.
But there's a more accessible, I call it the hidden side of the military. It's funnier, it's wackier, it's more improvisational, and it cuts against a lot of the stereotypes, even the positive stereotypes that exist about the military. So the goal of the book was to cobble those together. I picked 5 traits as the format to do it and to bring those lessons to everyone who was interested.
Well, why don't we take those traits? Let's give all 5 and then stick them one by one and talk about how they're applicable maybe to startups and founders out there that are looking for some core principles to apply to their business and their companies.
No, I think there's definitely crossover there, because especially when it comes to glorification of intensity, there is a time and a place for intensity, for maximum level commitment, but you have to be strategic about how you do that, or you're going to run into some problems. So the 5 traits, and I'll just name them, I'll save the descriptions for later. Self-awareness, initiative, adaptability, efficiency, and insistence is the last one.
Okay.
And I'll give you that definition because it's not as common a term. Insistence is all about setting standards and enforcing them, setting boundaries and enforcing them. That's what insistence is.
Well, let's take the first one.
All right. So certainly. So self-awareness is something, like I said earlier, I gradually worked toward when I got out of the military. I had a much better picture of who I was in the military. And what I realized that there's certain factors about that environment that help you become more self-aware. And one of the reasons my transition was awkward is that environment changed in ways I didn't realize. They gave us 3 days of training. They do their best, but it's hard to train somebody to leave the military and just go into a whole new life. You're around people so much in the military that you almost have to become more self-aware, because the kind of things that will go unremarked on in civilian life
Mm,
You don't let them slide when you're in the same hut with somebody
mm,
for 12 hours a day for a year.
yeah.
And you don't have to deploy. We spend a lot of time around each other in a lot of different circumstances. The
Yeah.
kind of things that you let slide actually come up, and actually you either have to accept them or work on them. But you can't just sort of minimize your interactions with people in ways that are primarily aimed at avoiding awkwardness. We will
Yeah. You can't
do
be passive aggressive like in so many corporate environments. You're sort of
exactly.
like, oh, I'm offended by what you said, but I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to kind of go along with this, and or
Yeah,
like
because
I don't agree with you, and I'm not going to disagree because I want to kind of I don't want to rock the boat and be uncomfortable and awkward.
yeah, and there's a downside risk to it. Somebody may not respond well. And it's understandable that if you only have to deal with something X amount of times in the military, you have to deal with it 5 or 10X because of how much you see people, then all of a sudden the cost of not dealing with it goes up. But
Yeah.
what you realize by being forced to deal with it is that the benefit of doing so is so much higher than it seems, and the cost is
Mm,
actually lower. So even when you adjust the math back to how often you deal with people in the civilian world, people consistently underestimate the benefits that come from
mm,
paying that price of potential short-term awkwardness and gaining knowledge about yourself and others in exchange. And
yeah.
it's almost necessary too. There's no better way to become self-aware. You have
Yeah.
to. I joke with people, I'm like, getting honest feedback, especially if you're in charge or if you're a founder, you're by yourself, you're in a high stress environment, there's a rapid tempo going on. It can be hard to get honest feedback. The TV show Undercover Boss, getting honest feedback is so hard. They made a TV show that's just based off people being honest with each other. So that puts it on the
Mm,
same tier as being a ninja and like finding a spouse. Right?
yeah.
That's how difficult it can be to get honest feedback. So it's not as if there is an easier alternate path. People just tend to go along to get along, and I understand why. And I'm not saying I never do that. I didn't
Yeah.
appoint myself everyone's life coach, but you look, it happens so rarely that even small steps, occasionally cracking open the door for feedback that makes you more self aware, will bring huge benefits. Luckily, you don't have to, it's not a new lifestyle you have to adopt.
Yeah.
It's just something to do at key moments about key subjects that gives you information you need to become more self aware and more effective.
Yeah. So, what are some stories that you can think of to drive home this point in either military or civilian life that you've experienced?
So we had this thing I called in Iraq. This is not a combat story. There's no combat stories in the book. It's all more interpersonal stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I called it the phone container. It was a converted shipping container where they had put in these thin plywood pseudo phone booths. But the problem was they didn't have any doors. They only went high up enough to prevent eye contact. You could hear what anyone else was saying,
Yeah.
but which was fine when the booth was full because it created this sort of din that was like white noise and master. But there's 2 other people in there and they're having a dramatic conversation, you know
Mm,
exactly what's happening. So I had never
yeah.
thought I would sit around and hear someone like break up with their spouse before,
Oof.
or talk to their kid for the first time. Self awareness is often about more positive interactions, realizing you're good at things that you doubted yourself for.
Mm,
It's not just about realizing you suck at something and that you need to stop sucking at it.
mm,
One of the things that's surprising in the military is that drill sergeants spend more time encouraging people than they do yelling at them, but obviously yelling makes for more compelling pictures.
right.
So in this phone container, I heard a broader spectrum of human interaction than I ever would have otherwise. But with 1 or 2 rare exceptions, where I was like, that was awkward. I wish I'd never heard that. And now I think you're a lot weirder than I did before. And I don't necessarily want to be around you. With 1 or 2 rare exceptions, I gained a deeper and more complete and more respectful understanding of what everyone was going through.
Yeah.
And getting that glimpse into people's lives had both made me respect them individually and understand them more individually, and put me in a more thoughtful and less reactionary place as a whole. So that's one example from the military where you get exposed to parts of people's lives you never would otherwise, but it's, with rare exceptions, it's not a burden, it's actually a benefit.
Yeah. All right. So, what's the second one?
Second one is initiative. And that's best encapsulated by the idea that you learn the importance of making decisions with incomplete information. You have to keep moving. This is something founders and entrepreneurs are probably already better than average at, because you have to get off the bench and make a decision. So, in the military encourages that by saying the worst thing you can do is nothing. and encouraging people in the training that we do. Very rarely does it amount to one person talking to a bunch of people and then nobody doing anything.
Mm,
It's almost always everybody tries the thing, everybody discusses the thing,
mm.
and we're encouraged to make mistakes. And there's an environment where this is where you make the mistake before you have to make the decision in a more consequential place. But you go to a lot of classrooms, a lot of workplaces, and there is no training ground. There is no sparring before the fight. And a lot of times that causes people to kind of be reticent about putting themselves out there in a way that keeps them from understanding the benefits of having that initiative.
And can you think of any stories that kind of highlight initiative or the lack thereof?
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
every type of soldier gets some basic infantry training. We will never be infantrymen. I worked in served with infantrymen, and I have nothing but respect for people whose job it is to carry a rifle instead of just having one with you just in case.
Mm,
But we all get a sprinkling of that. And it can be hilarious to watch people who don't do that full time try to learn how to do that decently.
mm.
So at one point, somebody just froze up. They just stood there like a store mannequin. And the squad leader came up and said, "I don't care what you do, do something." And they ran off in a direction it was wrong, but they came back and like, "Good job making a decision. Make a different decision next time."
Yeah. Here.
But and this is the kind of person where if they hadn't been put on the spot, they would have never put themselves in that
Just
situation.
frozen fear, and that's the exact wrong thing you want to do on the battlefield, right? It's just sort of
Exactly.
stand there like a duck,
Yeah, and in most situations, it could be asking out somebody you want to ask out, pursuing a business deal, a contact at a conference or some other place where the option of doing nothing. There's always going to be a short-term benefit to
Mm,
doing nothing, but you have to get out there. Now, some doesn't mean you have to do everything all the time.
mm.
Just like there's edge cases with self-awareness, there's edge cases with anything. And one of the reasons I mention that is because the military can be often portrayed primarily as an extremely intense, gung ho, risky environment. And there's
Mm.
elements of truth to that, especially in combat. But most of the time, it's more about controlled, smart initiative, where you try something out in a way where failure is going to be a teacher and not a disaster. And you can find ways to take initiative without being reckless and without being without being unduly
Yeah.
reckless.
This kind of reminds me of I worked at Amazon back in the day. It's starting to be a while back now, 6 years.
Yeah, when do you say back in the day?
Yeah,
How much time has to pass?
yeah, it's not that far. But one of their cultural principles, which is very much, I mean, that whole culture, they hire a lot of former military at Amazon, and I'm guessing Bezos, when he wrote down some of these cultural principles, was probably influenced by some military officers um, there, and one of them is disagree and commit. Which these first two kind of very much sound like that, like being aware that you disagree with something and taking initiative to state it, but also like following orders once the plan is made,
I
right?
used to tell my soldiers, go get your no. Right? They'd want to do something, attend a training school, handle a problem a certain way, do this, do that. Like, go ask, right? Make it known that you have that preference.
Mm,
But once you get the no, don't keep bringing it up over and over again unless something important has changed.
mm,
Don't have the initiative to get out there and do that. But as we get into the other traits, make sure you adapt to the new plan. Don't
yeah,
don't be this little source of a rebel faction. Like, if you're right and you have decent leadership, it will become known. And if you're right and you have crappy leadership, nothing you can do. All you're going to do is cause drama. So you've got to be able to pick your spots and know when initiative has to give way to adaptability.
yeah. One example I can think of, I'm reading my father-in-law's book right now that he's about to release called Sergeant Major, and it's not his first book on the military, but it's the encompassing book on his
Yeah,
career, his 38-year career.
it's amazing.
Yeah, and one of the things he was special forces and also
Oh,
paratrooper
nice.
as well. And one of the things he talks about is language pay. I guess you get a
Yep,
differential pay.
that's what I got for a while.
Yeah, but I guess like a lot of people don't get it, and they have to like they get kind of rammed with against their face with bureaucracy, and they'll have this back language pay, and he just tells all these stories in this book of like just railing against the bureaucracy and just taking
That,
initiative.
yeah, and that's one of the reasons that I want to talk about some of these other non-intense virtues, because I would trade a lot for one great admin person in any given military unit.
That's the kind of recurring theme I've seen over decades of his career is when you get a good admin person, they take care of it, it's all done.
Yeah.
And then you get this like one lady who's like very bad at her job and is doing the minimum, and everybody pays the cost. Anyway, what's the third one?
So the third one is adaptability. And the idea there is that people too often think the plan is the point. Well, the plan was supposed to accomplish something.
Mm,
And if you reach a stage where the plan's not going to do that anymore, things have changed, people have changed, you have to have the adaptability to change as well. And best case scenario, you can change proactively. You don't have to wait until there's failure or drama or stress or strain. You can take a look at things in a recurring way and think, hey, there's a better way to do this and we can get ahead of the problem. Best example I can think of for that for the military is basic training had this experience previously that was called the shark attack. And what it means is normally there's one or two drill sergeants per 30-ish trainees. But when the day that you show up at basic training, a horde of drill sergeants, they would pull them from neighboring units, would just descend on the newly arrived group of trainees. And the idea was to just sort of have this clean break with your civilian life and to just sort of intimidate everyone into compliance. What they realized, and again, there were no lawsuits, nobody died. What they realized is that people were quietly being driven away from the military because of this.
mm,
Because they thought, if this is what it's going to be like, I am out. They didn't know yet that this was a blip. This is a one-off thing that never recurred. In fact, you barely have a drill sergeant, depending on what you do, 1 or 2% of your whole career. But they didn't know that. So the military on its own decided to change that
mm.
and got rid of it and now have a more team building. You may still get yelled at. It's part of the charm.
Yeah.
But it's no longer the point. And what I thought was fascinating is that shark attack. You know where it came from? Vietnam,
Mm,
because it was the go to war or go to jail era. And the
yeah.
military had to absorb people who had criminal records and maybe weren't planning on joining the military, worse than being drafted, right? They really didn't have
Right.
any other options. So,
It's a way to get out of going to jail back then, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
So, in order to ensure that those people who may have had, significant criminal records, in order to ensure that they weren't a threat to the institution, they instituted the shark attack as a way to assert control in an aggressive way. Well, it's not Vietnam anymore, but somehow for 40 years, maybe more, 45,
Mm.
that remained the case. But they
They're
finally
basically
got
stress testing whether or not they'll follow orders under pressure, more or less.
Exactly. But they eventually realized that it was driving people out
Hmm.
and it was causing far more damage than it was good. And it was time to update things. And it is still very clear who's in
Yeah.
charge. And there's always the grumbling from the old timers. And that's true for every era. And I look forward to my grumbling days at some point.
It reminds me of some of the tactics of some of my jobs in my 20s. I worked on Wall Street and various kind of startups and financial institutions in my 20s. And, this kind of environment is
Yeah.
reminiscent of some of the tactics they would use to shock and awe you into submission, right? As a 20 something kid, wet
Yeah.
behind the
And
ears, like new in
yeah,
your
and
career.
it's so dangerous, at least in the military situation, because in the military situation, we want these people to pivot to being autonomous thinkers pretty quickly. So I need you to be able to go from getting yelled at and being terrified of making a mistake, and then what, in a year, maybe less, depending on your job, you will be in charge of people. You will be in charge of operations, not invading Normandy, but like operations on a meaningful scale in the
Yeah.
little neighborhood that you're in. I can't beat you into submission like that and necessarily expect to turn around and have you be and show initiative that much later if you're so afraid of making a mistake. So,
Yeah.
and maybe that work. I don't think it's a great idea anywhere, but maybe it works at least better in an institution where you're going to be in a junior place for a long time. Military, no, we need you to develop these things. We need
Yeah.
the 19-year-olds to turn around and be in charge of two 18-year-olds after 6 months, a year of service, depending on the
Right.
job. Like, I can't have you scared into robotness. We
Yeah.
need to develop you. One of the great things about the military, and one of the reasons I think it develops what it does, is we have to treat everybody that comes in the door like you're going to be here 20 or 38 years. Right? I don't know who's going to stick around and leave, so I gotta invest in all of you because I can't afford to not invest in you and have you stay. Whereas in the private sector, there's a presumption that you'll come and you'll go, and if you want to jump forward, maybe you'll switch jobs, and then maybe you'll go separate, go to get an MBA or go get an executive MBA. Or you will
Right.
leave the organization to get better, and then we get to reap the benefits when you come back. We don't
Right.
do that in the military. You don't go join like the British Army and learn some stuff and come back. Like, no, we have to develop you.
Mm.
So we invest in teaching people to learn to be adaptable in ways that a lot of organizations don't. It's understandable that they don't, but they don't, and that means
Yeah.
that people can often not get a chance to develop those traits.
Well, and our whole education system too kind of churns out people who are not adaptable, right? It's kind of like, this is what we're going to study, and we're going to take a midterm, and now we're going to take a test and move on. And it doesn't teach like, quick thinking on your feet and being adaptable to the changing circumstances.
Yeah, there is a sense of defensiveness that can set in where everybody just wants to figure out what the right answer is and give it.
Mm.
And the actual, it doesn't have to be the Socratic method, but some sort of analytical learning process where you're not just figuring out what you're supposed to say. You're going through the steps yourself, and maybe you come up with a different answer, but you're doing it in a way that teaches you a skill that you can bring forward. It's a lot harder to execute, and grade inflation has been a huge problem. And in part because the way it was done before was also dumb in its own way. So grade inflation is bad, but it exists like a lot of problems because a previous problem existed already, and there was an attempt to fix that. If 20% of the people in the class, and I have to deal with this as an adjunct sometimes, depending on the institution and the policies, I would like to give an A to everyone that deserves it. And is that a subjective decision? Depends on the course. But so I find it very frustrating when there's some sort of hard cap on that, because classes vary in size and vary in level of understanding that they reach during the semester. So and for all these
the enforced
reasons,
curve where you have to curve it, and
yeah. And you don't tell me that like either an elite school or an elite program within a school isn't filled full of people who are going to do a great job, like 80% of them. And what you're going to tell me that only 20% of them can get A's? Like it's arbitrary and it's pointless, and it leads to people.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like
out.
if you're good enough to get into an elite school, you probably are an A student anyway.
Yeah.
So like we might end up, like you said, handing out 80, 90% A's. These are all elite students. They got into an elite university.
Yeah, a lot of this isn't relative. It's you versus the material, not you versus your neighbor. This is not the Super Bowl. Like you can all do great. Like there's not one trophy that goes out at the end.
Yeah, I like that.
So the military, because of that, does a good job of teaching people and developing people, because it is that everybody gets to move forward, not that 20% of you can get the best mark. We occasionally have like
we move forward together
list at a school, and
we're
one of the things I have in the self-awareness chapter is poking some holes. Like, hey, the military does suck at some things, because I wanted to show the self-awareness of that. It's not necessarily a temple of perfection, but it does do some things uniquely well.
So what's the fourth one?
Efficiency. So I walked into basic training expecting what everybody else expects basic training.
Metal jacket.
Yeah. I was hoping nobody
sleeping with your rifle.
But yeah, spoilers. But at the same time, I was expecting intensity to be the most important thing. So we're in there, and one of the first things you have to do is put your name on your canteen. Canteens are these old plastic Vietnam era hunks that you pour water into and drink from. And they're indestructible, but they're also indistinguishable from each other. So masking tape, write your name. So throws a roll of masking tape on a desk, 4 markers, and says, hey, privates, put your names on your canteens. And we all walk up to the table like a ton of puppies trying to eat out of one bowl of food, and it's just chaos. And he watches us for a bit and sort of laughs. And then he comes back and he's like, privates, big piece of tape, 4 corners of the room, A through F, G through K, on and on. 4 markers, you get 4 markers for a reason. And he looks back at us on his way out the door and goes, work smart, not hard, privates. And leaves. And I was like, I was not expecting to be told by my drill sergeant to not work hard. But his lesson was very much look at efficient ways to do things. Don't just throw yourself at a task, or it's like a boxer who's going to punch themselves out. You have to be smart about how you apply yourself. It doesn't mean you're lazy. It doesn't mean that you don't care. But you cannot just sprint at everything and try as hard as you can to do everything immediately. Like, be smart, be aware of circumstances, and ensure that you're putting effort forth in a sustainable way. And that was a real shock to me. I was expecting the full, like, people in my face yelling, why aren't you working harder? It'd be the only piece of feedback you got. But they were very much about efficiency and about teaching you to work smart.
Yeah, that's a really good story, and I can see how the drill sergeant was trying to instill a lesson right there, right from the get go in training.
Yeah,
That's really
absolutely.
interesting.
And I've seen people, whether it's in the law, whether it's in business, whether it's in just about anything these days, especially as I love remote work. I'm currently remote 2 days a week, and it will be hard for me to ever go back in the
Oh
office
yeah,
these
I'm
days.
remote 5 days a week. I'll never go back.
Yeah, I'm trying to angle my way towards that. And we'll see if there's actually some training courses being developed based off the book. So I might get more remote than I am in the not
Yeah,
too distant future.
it's great. It's
Right? It's
fantastic.
amazing.
And
For
move out a couple hours from DC, and yeah, it's
Yeah,
really
the
nice.
flexibility is incredible. But
Yeah,
some people, and I'm not saying it's their fault, it can be stressful to always be accessible. So that instinct that was already present to work, to show maximum dedication can be even harder to get past because
yeah.
now there's even more and more ways to show how uh, ultra committed you are. And
Well,
so it can
yeah,
be
and
even harder for people to be
that's the
efficient.
best thing about the work from home remote kind of movement since COVID is we used to equate butts and seats and time in the building with productivity, and it's absolutely not the case.
That was bizarre to me when I was at the law firm, and I had a good experience there. But you finish a task quickly, and your reward's just more work. And the metric you're measured on is how many hours you spent, not how much you got done. Now, don't get me
mm,
wrong. If you build up a reputation over time of doing things quickly, then it'll benefit you in other ways. But it's a very indirect benefit. And at the end of the day, butts and seats, hours when the button was pushed, that was the metric that was
yeah,
used. And that was one of the reasons I didn't end up pursuing that full time was that type of ecosystem, just especially coming out of the Army where efficiency is one of the 5 things I picked to talk about.
yeah,
Working somewhere where that wasn't a priority was going to be a difficult adjustment for me.
yeah. Efficiency was number 4, right? So now we're on the
Was
last one, number
Yep, we're on the
5.
last one, which is insistence. And this is something that I saw a lot of people struggle with. And this more than the other traits also covers friends, family, that type of relationship too. And those can be a little difficult to talk about, but I think it's important to at least mention in this context. Here's what I mean by that. It is very easy to find yourself trying to adapt to the world because it seems like the most immediately accessible way to solve a problem. If somebody wants me to do something, maybe I'll do it. Uh, the problem is it's you have to be able to set standards and set boundaries. Otherwise, the world will constantly encroach on you
Mm,
and will ultimately squeeze you into a shape that maybe you don't want to be in. Now, one of the things I mentioned in the book is you should have standards, but other people get to have standards too. So you can't be mad when they have standards that exclude you, but you want to have standards that exclude them. So there will be a bit of boundary drawing, map making when it comes to you and the people around you. But far too often I see people end up resenting those around them.
yeah,
Often when it was unintentional on the taker's part. When they're just asking, and if people say yes, they're going to keep asking. And it's not out of some hyper selfish desire to exploit anybody. It's just because the other person can't draw that line. One of the workplace examples of this is it is hard to say no to work. I remember the first piece of freelance writing I said no to as
mm,
a young up and coming writer, and who had because you go through that curve of like somebody pay me to write, please.
mm.
And the first time you say no, it feels like you are stealing from yourself. But you realize that you have to have that boundary at some point. And I find that that is something that the military does an excellent job of doing in terms of obviously we have a bajillion written standards in the military, but a lot of these standards and a lot of these traits in general are about unwritten norms that exist, the environment that exists. My favorite example about this, quick story, is at the end of basic training, there's a honor graduate award and one soldier per platoon. So 4 nominees, if you will, go up against each other indirectly. We all go in, we answer questions for a board, they send the next person in. So we're not like in a pit fighting each other for this, but we do answer all the same questions. Drill sergeant comes up to me and he says, "Who are you competing with for this award?" I say, "No, drill sergeant, I'm competing with these 3 other soldiers." He goes, "Wrong." He just looks at me, he doesn't say anything. And I'm like, like, do I try to fix the constant question based training? Do I keep talking or do I just kind of sit here and wait for knowledge to arrive? So I waited, and he just looks at me and goes, "You're competing against the standard." And turns around and leaves again. That was his thing. He could like ninja vanish and just like drop some knowledge and leave. And what I learned from that was it's easy to get caught up in who's around you at any given time, who you're competing with, personally or professionally. But what lasts, what is sustainable is aiming for a certain standard. And maybe you win and maybe you lose any given day. But by not getting caught up in the personalities that surround you and some of those circumstances that are ephemeral and that will change, you can have a much steadier and more stable existence even while pushing forward pretty aggressively because you're not getting caught up in short-term drama. And that's what insistence is all about. It's a little more philosophical than the other ones, but I think in some ways it's what underpins all of them.
So thinking about your military career and civilian life and startups in general, like how do you balance risk with caution?
I am all about taking risk, but trying to take it in ways where failure is protected. I was talking to my wife the other day, and I was like, we're kind of insured, trying to make sure, talking long term, she might go to grad school, et cetera, et cetera. We're like, I think we're insured against every significant financial risk we could face. Right. So knowing that, let's take some risks. Let's invest in some, whether it's house improvements, education. Let's take some risks and put ourselves, instead of just hoarding things like some kind of, literature dragon, like let's actually take some risks because we have, to the extent possible, insured against the downsides of doing so.
Yeah.
So the military is all about controlled aggression, controlled risk. Try to find ways where you can set up I'm developing with an HR consultancy a training course based off the book. We're doing demos, not to the point where we're over repping and burning ourselves out, but you want to publish, right? You want to get things out there, and then you tweak it, you refine it, version 1.1.1, 1.1.2, making these small refinements. So the first version I did of the demo course, bad lighting, slides weren't completely done, but I was like, I got a trip coming up if I don't record this thing now, and I'll send an admittedly kind of crappy looking version to people and get their feedback. And I knew that I could create something better, and it was kind of a risk because people might look at this and make some early judgments off things that were going to change. But it's a risk I had to accept in order to get it out there and start refining it and start iterating on it. So I am pro risk, but this is where self-awareness kicks in. You have to know if you're a swashbuckler, if you see yourself as some sort of bestride the world, Giga Chad, captain of industry. You have to know which way you lean and compensate for that. So I'd say if you've done the self-awareness check and you know just what your worst tendencies are, as long as you're not going to overdo it, then be pro risk.
Makes sense. Why don't we switch to a quick rapid fire, if that works?
Certainly.
What's your favorite book of that you've ever read?
It's a book called The Savage Detectives by Roberto Bolaño. It's
Never heard of that.
I was in Iraq, Afghanistan, and I was just scrolling down. This is when Metacritic still did book reviews, which I'm really sad that they stopped doing. And it got great reviews, and I read it, and it really took me into a world that I'd never been in before. And but it was still very grounded in people, and it combined both sort of, if I remember, there's elements of kind of magical realism to it, but it's not all the way in that direction. So it was a good mix of grounded and a little bit fantastical and very imaginative.
Oh, very cool. What was the most challenging moment in your military career?
We got the one time in my career, we got asked, we were given an illegal order. And the people giving it's one of those things where the people who give that order are going to be punished a lot less than the people who execute it. So they know that there's an uneven risk in amongst the group of people dealing with this decision. So we had to have a little huddle on our team and say, hey, we are not going to do this. It was like, I have seen movies. I know we go to jail. They get letters in their files, right? There's a difference here in terms of where we're at, rank wise and bureaucracy wise. And I had never dealt with that that was somebody who was being too risky, who was being too aggressive. And I understood they faced some pressures, but other people faced those pressures too and didn't buckle. But luckily, we pushed back. He backed down. I didn't break the law. Everything turned out fine.
Nice. What's a law you wish you could change?
Right now, immigration law. And there's 100 different ways to change it, but let's just say, to keep it simple, to not do another hour podcast, systems overflow because the channels things are supposed to flow through don't work.
Mm.
And I understand people want to look at it from a moral perspective and from a risk or crime perspective, and there's certainly discussions to be had on those. But you have to have a way for people to do the right thing, aka come in through approved channels that allow us to have enough control over what's going on. But if you ignore the problem, especially if you're ignoring it to exploit fears about it, I have no patience for that. So that's something, and I think it has all these second order effects on availability of jobs and et cetera, et cetera. H-1B visas, especially for, more educated workers. So whether it's somebody, and I'm half Hispanic, so I get this. I have family connections to this issue as well. But yes, whether it's high education or low education labor, there's so many things tied back to immigration. I think it's more than one law. So I'm kind of cheating.
Yeah, it's kind of a series of laws.
Yeah. So, but that's what I'll pick.
Yeah, that's the tough one. What's a game that you enjoyed most writing a guide for or a review of? Because you used to write about video games, and I'm a gamer, so
I'll pick one of each because I used to do guides and reviews. Guides paid better, and the best thing about video games is they only made guides for good games. So it's not like a movie where you have to review it even if it sucks. Same for games.
So you'd literally like play through the game and kind of write the step-by-step guide?
Back in the day, I would take screenshots, stitch them together in Photoshop, do a little Illustrator work, the whole thing. I still have some PDFs of the old guides that I did.
Nice.
I did one for a Super Mario RPG. I'm sorry, was it Mario?
They just re-released that one on Switch.
I know. I'm excited about that. I haven't played it either, but that was in the review I'll pick is there was this PlayStation RPG. It was originally on the Sega Saturn in Japan and then got switched to the PlayStation. I think it only came out in America on the PlayStation, called Grandia. And the reason I mention it is it got all these great reviews and I fucking hated it.
Oh.
So as I'm playing it, and I'm JRPGs are what I grew up on.
Dude, Chrono Trigger, like that is my favorite game of all time. Final Fantasy 2 and 3,
exactly.
4 and 6 in Japan.
Exactly.
There's a special place in my heart.
Yeah, getting to interview the creator of the Final Fantasy series was a professional highlight for me.
That's cool.
So I'm all about JRPGs, and it was I knew what I was getting myself into, but I couldn't lie about the game. I thought it was horrible. So it was one thing I knew I was.
But you had to write a guide for it?
No, didn't have to do a guide for it. Thankfully.
Just a review.
Just a review. But even then, that was definitely got some questions afterwards, and some. Luckily, this is before the gaming community at that point, because this is a while ago, hadn't reached quite the level of toxicity that it can reach now.
Oh yeah, it's pretty.
So it's not like I got death threats, but I got a lot of like.
Yeah, you get swatted now.
Yeah,
find out where you live and send a SWAT team there and kill your family or something.
It's insane. Just like go outside. I mean, before I joined, I joked earlier about not dating at that stage in my life. So I'm not coming from a place of judgment when it comes to people who devote a lot of time to video games. Not at all. But come on, y'all. Like, go outside a little bit. At least look outside. Like, stop acting so crazily. Exactly. So, yeah, that's probably the most memorable review because it cut the most strongly against popular opinion on the game.
No, that's fun. What's one word to describe your teaching style?
Free, loose. They allow me to do 3-hour Zoom sessions during the pandemic. I was like, there is no way in hell I'm doing a 3-hour Zoom session.
Nobody wants that.
Like nobody wants that. I'm not boring, but I'm not that interesting. Like 3 hours? Are you kidding me? So I told him, hey, we're doing an hour, maybe 90 minutes, and the rest of it, I'll spend time giving you feedback on your work. I'll schedule one-on-one calls, whatever you want. But no, I tend to be very conversational and loose with the teaching. I'm teaching an ethics class as part of an MBA program, so it's not like I'm teaching a hard science class where I really need to make sure quantitative stuff happens correctly. So part of it is what I teach gives me the freedom.
A good class. I took that in my MBA program. That was a really good class. You start talking about the moral imperative, and you start talking about different philosophers and points on it. It's really fun.
Yeah.
What's the most influential person in your career?
My current boss's boss. And I'm very lucky to be in a structure where I get to interact with this person. It's a former 2-star general who is in charge of the Alaska National Guard before she took over the position she's in now. I do whistleblower protection work right now as part of the National Guard. And she is the head inspector general for the entire National Guard. And I'm not just saying my current boss because, just in case she listens or anything, but watching somebody who, what I really admire about her is she lets her position do the work. Sometimes you'll see people in a position of importance who feel the need to reinforce that they're in a position of importance all the time, and it's just insecure. but she lets it do the work and is only more firm when necessary.
Yep.
And it gives people, like, I've been working on stuff. I feel like I have that freedom to explore, to take risks that we talked about. So that's someone who's very influential on me now in terms of seeing how someone at the top of the food chain can both hold people to a standard, but allow people the freedom to meet that standard and introduce new ideas when they have them.
I love that. What's a country you haven't visited but want to?
Let me think. Russia, if I could be safe. I was stationed in Italy for a while, about a 3 hour
Probably throw
flight.
you in the gulag and try to get a ransom from.
Yeah, I need to pick a new country. I was trying to
No
figure
offense,
out.
Russia or Russians listening.
You know what? Let me just. This is bad of me, but I can just say South America because I haven't been anywhere there. So we'll
Oh
say
yeah,
Argentina. I've heard it's a place that's both a deep cultural history and a lot of fun at the same
I
time.
love LATAM. Like anywhere south of the border, like south of Mexico too is really amazing. Guadalajara. I've been to Costa Rica, Chile, Colombia was amazing. It's
Yeah, I would love to
all the
go there.
oh, it's so amazing down there.
Because that
And
would
I
be a
have
fun place. I picked Russia because I want to know more about why that place is the way it is. But in terms of a place I would actually enjoy and not be looking literally over my shoulder,
yeah.
I'm gonna go with we'll say Argentina.
That's amazing. What's the best piece of advice you ever received?
Not to I don't know if it's lazy to me to refer back to something I already mentioned, but it was what that drill sergeant said about competing against the standard.
Mm,
And just thinking about being the best version of yourself. And yeah, I wanted to beat the other three people and win the honor graduate, and I was lucky enough to do that. But if some baller had been in my group and had won instead of me, it doesn't mean I'm a crappy soldier all of a sudden.
mm,
And it's good. And I tell soldiers when they're worried about awards, sometimes you will get awards you don't deserve, and sometimes you won't get ones that you do deserve. You just have to hope that it evens out over time.
mm.
And the way to do that is to just work hard and be aware. I'm not saying always put your nose down and never look for ways to stick up for
Yeah,
yourself, but don't get so bummed out by one unfair thing happening that you lose sight of what you need to be doing. So
yeah.
think about the standard, continue to meet the standard, and those good things that do or don't happen along the way will build up over time, even if you miss out on some occasionally along the way in a way that feels unfair.
Yeah. Well, in true efficient military fashion, we got through all of the rapid fire questions, which I don't normally do. So that I think that's it.
Good. I was worried I
It's,
was giving too long answers to them,
no,
so
it's
I'm glad
great.
we
Yeah,
got through them.
you were very efficient with your answers.
There you go.
Like somebody who's a JD and was a military captain.
Well, you know what it
Uh,
is talk about self awareness. I am too talkative. That's my default setting. I've gotten
mm,
better about it. And it was funny because I joked with my publishers like I'm an extrovert, but I'm not necessarily a salesman. And people can
yeah.
think one equates to the other. But another thing about talked about the military spending a lot of time around people is you don't have to sell them on how good you are. They see you enough to know,
Right.
and it's a relief. But it doesn't necessarily prepare you for the civilian world where you do have to be more proactive about showing what you're capable of.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely try to balance out level of detail versus going on too much when it comes to answering questions.
Yeah. And I'm a terrible listener in normal life. And here I have to listen. So I really like these podcasts because it enforces me to talk to really interesting people and learn from them. And part of the reason I do it. So thanks for coming on. Could have definitely chatted with you for another hour.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. It was a good chance to dig into some of these, and it's always good to think of it from a particular perspective, entrepreneur, VC perspective as well.
Yeah. Thanks, John.
Thank you.